Today, have Chandrapal, Badshah with me, and we're going to talk about least privilege. Uh, Chandrapal, would you introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, hi Stephen. So I'm Chandrapal Badshah. I've been working in and around cloud and cloud native security for about 5 years now. So my day-to-day job, and I'm a defender. So my day-to-day job is like to holistically defend cloud. So it's not just AppSec or throw a bunch of fancy tools called DevSecOps tools in the pipeline and like secure it. It's more like, okay, if this is the risk that we see, how are we going to tackle it from multiple angles, be it from cloud, code, cluster, or container, right? So that is what I work on. Yeah, I do experiment a lot, especially on production. That's a privilege very few people get, to be honest. And yeah, publish it on my blog so that my future self or other people who are interested in the topic can actually learn from that.
Yeah, super. Well, thank you. And so I'm Stephen Kuenzli. I lead Canine Security, and we've been working for quite a while to help cloud teams integrate security into their delivery workflows and into production and actually scale security. So, uh, Chandrapal, you wrote a post which I'll put in the notes on like the ultimate guide to fail at least privilege in cloud, which is quite a title. I love that. Everybody loves hearing about people's journey, especially when we talk about the failures and the hard parts. So, what prompted you to write about least privilege in the first place?
Least privilege is one of the buzzwords you get to hear a lot whenever you're networking with people or go to some fancy conference. People talk a lot of buzzwords. Like the topmost would be LLM and AI at this moment, but in security, let's say RSA or other conferences, it's all about zero trust, least privilege that would solve your problems. Like you have to ensure access control is present, authentication and authorization, right? So a lot of buzzword happens whenever you're networking, but in reality, when you try to implement on your production, right, everyone's opinion on how it should be done is different. So I've always heard about least privilege. The first time I actually understood what least privilege is, it was pretty magical. I thought it would solve most of my problems. Like let's imagine an ideal world where, okay, a developer wants to upload objects to S3 bucket. He magically writes a IAM policy, which is like very restricted to a single bucket, and then he deploys that application, right? But in reality, when I tried to do that, it didn't work out.
Right.
So then I reached out to a couple of my friends who are into cloud security as well. They said their approach is very similar, but there's a lot of pain points, and no one was talking about that. So I thought, let me try writing a blog post which highlights all these points.
Yeah, yeah. So, uh, you called out like five or six things that you failures you encountered in implementing least privilege, and I agree that there's a big difference between least privilege as marketed and least privilege as achievable by teams moving at speed with any sort of scale. Like, you have 5 or 10 teams, and least privilege is really challenging to implement with that because, like, there's minimally thousands of permissions, and it's like, well, what that might be in scope for that your organization is using legitimately, and so what is this developer or engineer actually supposed to do? What are the real expectations? So can you talk about a few or like maybe the one or two most important failures that you encountered in like learning experiences?
Right, right. So I would say the first failure was assuming that IAM is pretty easy. That
Mhm.
is my first failure. And like to add to that point, I assume that it's pretty easy for developers to learn that it's just a JSON policy. You have action, you have a bunch of permissions and conditions, the basics. So I thought this would be pretty easy, but in the real world, no. Developers are working hard and they have their own problems to solve, and expecting they learn about IEM is an over expectation, in my opinion. That's what I've seen. And second thing is each company is unique, and whatever work for someone does not work for everyone. So just because we failed at a particular point, that doesn't mean everyone would fail at that point, and that the vice versa is also true. That just because we did least privilege in a particular fashion, it might not work for everyone. It worked for us in a particular fashion because we have developers of a particular experience level, and we have certain engineering practices in place.
That's so true. Um, and just going back to the first thing you mentioned, like that not that IAM systems are not easy to understand necessarily. Like I come from a development background, and I remember when I was learning AWS IAM, and I I was already a pro at declarative languages like Terraform and so forth. Um, but it took me a while to wrap my head around the principal action resource model and the differences like okay, every time I want to call an action or an API method on one of these APIs that I need to allow the permission, and there are these like different resources, and like just understanding the model can be quite a challenge. And one thing about cloud IAM systems is they never get simpler out of the box anyway. They always get more powerful and more flexible, which results in more complexity that is available for use. Now, you don't, of course, need to use it necessarily, but wrapping your head around these models can be quite a challenge, and creating a mental model that engineers can apply successfully, that it's actually to make security usable, so they understand what it is that they need to do, and then can verify that they did what they intended. Like that's a real challenge. And as you said, building building systems and tools and processes that work for different levels of different kinds of teams. Maybe you have like an e-commerce team um, that is comfortable with certain technologies and certain processes and code reviews and stuff like this. And maybe you have a data warehouse team that is not, or like they use different technologies. And these all matter, like because we have, their experience in making security accessible is going to, in order to make security accessible and usable to them, like we have to go meet them where they are. Like AWS IAM, Azure RBAC, et cetera, they're not going to go meet those teams where they're at. Cool. So, are there any other like points that you don't see working that you want to talk about related to least privilege, or like big challenges that you had?
I would say so. People and technology is often like not considered whenever you're trying to implement least privilege, and I've seen that as a big failure, and especially at what stage of security you are at. So if you're beginning, like you are starting, if you're going from 0 to 1 in cloud security, anyone looking at least privilege is not going to succeed.
Yeah.
So I've seen one person that I personally know. They tried to do everything at the same time: CSPM, get a bunch of open source tools, get alerts from Access Advisor, and all those stuff. it didn't work out. So trying least privilege, or like trying to attempt least privilege while you're going to while you're securing your cloud is maybe one way to fail at cloud security. Second is ensure that your people and process are onboarded with least privilege. And yeah, these are the two things. And talking about technology wise as well, at least on AWS, so there are lots of let's say features that are missing. So even now I'm like the topmost uh, point in my wish list for AWS IAM is how to ensure, how to write a rule that ensures everyone has MFA enabled who has console access. Like there is no single tick button, or there's no single feature in AWS that says like, okay, for every IAM user that has console access, enable MFA. So there are a bunch of SCPs that are around, but they don't work actually.
Mm.
So it just blocks for a non-technical person. It's very hard for them. Like there are greater chances that they get blocked rather than they go ahead and like AWS telling them this is how you enable MFA for you.
Yeah.
And there are other things like just-in-time access and stuff, which is not present in AWS unless you have a specific tooling for that.
Right. 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 So, so what do you see working to implement least privilege, or like, what is your philosophy on how to approach this stuff, both like from a strategy and a tactic level? Like how do you, what is the path that you're taking now?
Okay, that's a good question. So after multiple failures, the first thing I got to understand in a hard way was get your engineering teams onboarded. Tell them why this is required. Not like there is always a question. Okay, what is the ROI I get of this? Or there are questions like, if my system is working pretty fine, why do you want to reduce the permissions of it? Like, why do you want? There is always a fear that I've seen. Like, okay, let's say you have not used a particular feature and your IAM policy or the IAM permission is removed. What if it causes a production incident? So there
Hmm.
is always an unknown element, right? So if your engineering team is not confident, or if they're not aligned with going towards least privilege, then not like there's no point of it. So first things was get the engineering team and the processes set. Second is understand what is your ideal position in the spectrum, because least privilege is a spectrum, as I mentioned on the blog post.
Yeah.
Uh, don't come or like select a position where you have the impact or the blast radius if something goes wrong is reduced, and at the same time your engineering folks don't have to create multiple tickets to get permissions.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of good stuff in there. Can you dig in a little bit to what you're talking about, the spectrum of least privilege and what you mean by blast radius, and like, is there a particular goal that you're trying to target, or that maybe you suggest you think about from a security perspective?
Right. So talking about least privilege spectrum, least privilege is a term, and got to understand it. It's not really literal. It's not the literal meaning of least privilege. So multiple companies say that we have implemented least privilege. That doesn't mean that they have granted very granular permissions on like what exactly they want to do on the particular application. So that's not the case. It could rather be on the resource level. Let's say you want to upload to a bucket, you have S3 star on just that bucket. So in case your application is compromised, the blast radius of that would be just on that particular bucket. You
Hmm.
could try to make it more granular, but the problem is for every new feature or every bug that occurs on production, there will be a lot of noise around that. Like grant more permissions for the developer to debug that, or grant more permissions for the application stuff. And there is the other side of the spectrum as well, where you give more lenient permissions, and that and then the more extreme you go towards that spectrum, you are going away from least privilege. So you're not just giving access to S3, but you're also giving access to say lambda functions and EC2 star for that particular application. So you have to find out what works best for your scenario and then fine tune it. The goal I would say is, if you're aiming for least privilege, then ensure you have the permissions that allows your engineering team to work seamlessly without a lot of permission requests. And at the same time, if something goes wrong, if let's assume your application is compromised, it does not allow the person to do a lot of damage, let's say lateral
Mhm.
movement in your cloud.
Right, right. Yeah, we help companies and organizations like kind of, to use an analogy, clean up their kitchen sink and help keep it clean, right? And and like when you're faced with like a real production improving the posture of a real like production account environment, least privilege gets pretty real pretty quick, in that you want to focus. We found it's very useful to focus on realistically the biggest threats, like who are who have administrative access, particularly IAM admins, or RBAC sort of admins, and then real in the event of a breach, what are the biggest risks here? Is
Right.
it to data? Is it crypto mining or something like that? Um, and in many cases, we find that it's really to data. And so, we go the next step, and it's useful to go to the next step and help teams figure out how they're going to protect access to their data in a way that scales, and then focus on like the top 3 or 5 data sources in the account, and like do a pass, get things clean, make sure everything is working. Because maybe you need infrastructure libraries to help support this, right? Maybe you need an access review mechanism, because like what you're building ultimately is an access control process that you can run continuously, because it's not going to be you going and checking the access all the time, right? Like who's responsible? Who do you want to be responsible for the access here?
Definitely not a single person or a team.
Right. Right. That might, I don't know if you listed that in your what's not working, but I will add one.
Mhm.
It does not scale to have a security specialist being
Right.
responsible for reviewing policies and access directly all the time, nor writing the policies. Like it just doesn't scale.
Uh, I that's a pretty great point, to be honest. Like, I've been there, I've made that mistake as well. And for people on being the security specialist, if you're the single person in the company who does this, it is not scalable. First things first.
Yeah.
Second is, you cannot go on a holiday. Forget your
Right.
holidays. If there is any kind of incident, you will be pulled up right in the
Everything's
midnight.
always an emergency.
Exactly, exactly. That's a great point. I missed writing it, but I've noticed this. Yes. So go there.
So
Don't
how,
have a single
yeah,
person.
so how are you getting out of that situation these days?
I would rather say automate as much as possible.
And what do
So
you mean
have
by automate? Like, can you go deeper on that?
right. So let's say what is the risk. So when we sat down on cloud security, right, we didn't want to go from zero to n at one go. We wanted to see, okay, what is our risk. So
Hmm.
what is the biggest concern that we have with cloud? Is it someone, just as you mentioned, someone hacking into it and like running ransomware, or any other risk? So we noted that down, and based on our risk appetite in our company, then we go take one at a time. So a lot of companies, I would say, would avoid misconfigurations by just running the open source crawler.
Hmm.
Just do a crawler scan. It does a bunch of things. So there will be a bunch of IAM alerts as well in that. So if you're into, like, if you're starting out in cloud security, that's the first thing. And next comes, okay, what are the things that Prowler does not do well, or what are the areas where Prowler doesn't cover? That is where you focus on based on its priority. Like, okay, this is my next risk, and I need to protect it, or if possible, prevent that from happening. So let's say, okay, Prowler takes care of a bunch of misconfigurations. My next risk is ransomware running on the cloud. So why would a ransomware, like, what would the ransomware running on cloud look like? Or let's say crypto jacking for crypto mining, for example. So you need larger boxes, larger VMs for crypto mining to happen. So you can write a SCP saying that, okay, my production workloads is not, must always follow a bunch of sizes. It should not be a VM size outside this. So you
Hmm.
block that. That's it. So
Yeah.
even if your account is compromised, the people behind crypto mining will not have a lot of luck. The same thing goes with region restriction. So that's how we are doing it right now.
Yeah, yeah. So that makes sense. So first, figuring out what your actual biggest risks are, then using some tools to help you get a handle on the basic configuration stuff, then putting some governance sort of guardrails in place to make sure like the big ones, the biggest risks are or some of the biggest risks are taken care of like out of the box. And then we can get into things like least privilege. Um, and do you have like infrastructure code libraries or like who's managing policies? Like, do you have automation to support that?
Good question again. We have automation, a custom built automation to check dangerous permissions.
Yeah.
Let's say simple things like IAM star, for example. No
Hmm?
application needs an IAM star except a bunch of applications managed by infra team. We don't want VPC delete flow logs or guard duty star. So guard duty and CloudTrail and all is managed by security team. So no other applications actually need those permissions. So we started out with a bunch of blacklist and started fine tuning it based on the requirements, and that worked a lot for us.
Super. Are there any other tips that you want to share with everyone who might be listening?
Right, right. So I think experiment with least privilege, and it should not be your first thing to solve in cloud. If you're starting out in cloud security, don't try to solve it. In this end of the spectrum is like start out, look for basic misconfigurations, and this side of the spectrum is where you go for all the buzzwords: least privilege, zero trust,
Yeah.
how CASP, and all those stuff, right? And there's a lot of things to be done when you want to go from here to here, right? And yeah, even though you go to this side of the spectrum, you will find a lot of gray areas. So be mindful of that, and don't don't think the same solution that worked for you for solving a particular problem would work for another problem. One common issue that I see is CI/CD pipelines, right?
Mhm.
AWS provides its own services. Every single company that uses Terraform, I've seen them use CI/CD pipelines. So what's the least privilege for CI/CD pipeline is a gray area for me right now. So we have not solved. I have not seen uh, any blog post or any solid uh, research or like experience which says like, okay, this is what you need to do to secure CI/CD pipelines on cloud, right? So yeah, just that, and I
Yeah,
would
I mean,
say,
that's great.
yep, and don't forget the four C's, which is cloud, cluster, container, and code. You could have an amazing team of engineers who are looking at the code side of things, AppSec engineers, product security engineers, however you call it. But don't ignore on the other three C's, right? So just because your application is secure, it doesn't mean it's not exposing a code on your infrastructure.
Right, right. Yeah, so I think this has all been great stuff. And you know, I've been working with folks integrating security into continuous delivery and doing the whole hashtag DevSecOps for quite a while. And this is all stuff. All the things you just spoke about are things that have come up in various ways, and I think it's so important that we talk about these kinds of things, like first think about your threat model, and then setting your blast radius, and actually partitioning workloads, and then getting down into like how do we implement a proper set of permissions that um, further tighten our blast radius while enabling the business or the organization to succeed. Um, and security is is important. So is availability, performance, and customer feedback. And so it being I think one of the most important things is for security to be um, done well. It has to be available and usable by the engineers who are shipping, and they need to, like, if we want security to be everyone's job, then we have to give uh, people the tools and the affordances and the processes to actually do security within their job. Um, and so that it doesn't overload security specialists either. That maybe this is another conversation, but I have an opinion that security specialists should be more enabling and governing, um, at least 80% of the time, and 20% in the weeds, for incidents, or investigating interesting stuff. So anyway, where can folks find more about your thoughts?
Okay, I maintain a blog called Badshah.io. That is where I put all my experiments, all the things that I learned and stuff. I'm a bit active on LinkedIn, so maybe we can share the LinkedIn URL
Yeah,
in the. Yeah, that's where. But if you're really interested in having a conversation, you can directly email me at bacha@bacha.io.
awesome, awesome. Well, that's great. Well, thanks for joining me to talk about least privilege, and I hope,
Hey,
yeah,
right. So before we close it, I
yeah.
just wanted to say the Effective IAM book that you have written, I'm like almost completing it and it's super awesome.
Oh,
Like
great. Well, thank you.
if anyone's getting started in AWS IAM to understand the complexity of it, and I really loved the chapter like why IAM is complex, right? So that's to the point. So that is a great read. It's a simple, I would say, a bunch of pages rather than calling a book, but it is super useful for that's something that I would recommend to everyone to learn about AWS IAM.
Great. Well, thank you. So that book was written specifically to help cloud engineers, whether you're application, security, etc., but to help cloud engineers integrate security into continuous delivery processes. So building and architecting IAM, and then uh, like how do we actually operate at speed? And the final chapter, which is all about really what we've been talking here, is like how do you actually scale security processes? How do you incentivize and enable people to do the right thing? Because in my experience, they do want to do the right thing. It may just not be easy enough, and people are under time pressure, and um, I'm listening to this a great video series by Ross Anderson, who wrote the book on security engineering. It's a great YouTube deal, and he's talking about, one of the things he's talking about is like making security usable, and that people have a compliance budget, um, and that security doing I am will consume, it needs to be doable within that compliance budget. But if it exceeds the compliance budget along with all the other things, well, it's not going to get done. And so
Right.
our job as security architects and security engineers, security leaders, technology leaders, is to help people, help our teams and organizations deliver securely, and enable them, motivate them, and also create some accountability within the organization. So I'm glad to hear you enjoy the book. It's free, or you can read it free online. It's also available on Kindle and so forth, and EPUB. But yeah, we'll get this out there and share some links. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about cloud security with me today. Thank you,
Yeah.
Chandrapal.
Thank you. Yeah.